I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
This is Moderate Rebels episode 6. Thanks for listening. There's been a lot of paranoia recently in the media and fear-mongering about a potential nuclear war with North Korea. President Trump actually went on TV and he threatened 25 million people living in North Korea with fire and fury. Defense Secretary Mad Dog Mattis also followed up those threats and claimed that the U.S. might respond with the destruction of North Korea's regime and the destruction of its people. We hear this borderline genocidal rhetoric going on. Well, here at Moderate Rebels, we've actually done some on-the-ground reporting. Max, you were in Korea recently, right?
Yeah, I just went to Seoul for a week. Airfares were extremely low, maybe because no one wants to go, although there's a constant flow of U.S. military personnel. And I decided just for research and reporting to spend a few days in Seoul, and I had lined up interviews with some of the local anti-war activists who you're going to hear from in our next two episodes, who are helping lead the protests, which are now centered around the town of Songju, which will be the site of the THAAD missile system, which Lockheed Martin is kind of forcing South Korea to buy. So I spoke to Hwang Soo-young and Gayun Baek from the People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, which is probably the main and anti-war NGO in South Korea, which is helping lead these protests, and Wol-san Liem, who is from the Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union, which not only does a lot of class-based union organizing, which we don't see much of in the U.S., but also brings, the force of organized, unionized workers into the anti-war protests because they see their military budget going up massively. And social programs and workers' protections being cut. So you're going to hear from these activists. And I also just went to see how the war is presented in South Korean society. This is a war that has never really ended. We're talking about perpetual conflict. There has not been a peace agreement signed, and that means that reunification is impossible because there has been no peace, and the lack of peace has been a boon for the U.S. arms industry. 20,000 troops entered South Korea, 20,000 troops led by the U.S. at Incheon in 1950, and 28,000 troops remain. And pretty much all the white people on my flight were connected to the U.S. military or intelligence services in one way or another. So it was really eye-opening. It reminded me, South Korean society reminded me distinctly of Israel in many ways and how militarized it is. The principal difference being that people in Korea are unfailingly polite and civil, and were also capable of driving automobiles. Their food was good and it wasn't stolen from other cultures. So those were some key differences with Israel. But I actually, in these interviews I did with activists, if you're familiar with Israel-Palestine, and particularly the Israeli society that I presented in my book, Goliath, I think you'll recognize a lot of the parallels.
Also, in the U.S., there's no context for what's actually happening. We just hear there's this cartoonish Hollywood villain who feeds his uncle to dogs and forces everyone to get the same haircut. I mean, these are blatantly false stories that are scattered throughout the press without any evidence. And there's, of course, no context for understanding why North Koreans do feel the kind of fear that they do and why they don't like the U.S. It's portrayed as this kind of like mindless anti-Americanism. But in reality, the U.S. carried out a war inside North Korea that even journalists at the time acknowledged was somewhat of a Holocaust. Probably around 3 million Koreans were killed from 1950 to 1953 in a U.S. war that we know here as the Forgotten War. There's almost no discussion of what happened. There's no historical recollection. And we actually have documentation now. We have people like General Curtis LeMay, who led Strategic Air Command during the Korean War and oversaw the horrific bombing campaigns. Curtis LeMay acknowledged, quote, over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population. So we have U.S. government officials on record acknowledging they killed about 1/5 of the entire population. But this is a war that's largely been erased from our own history books, right, Max?
Well, one of the things that kind of attracted me to this history is how little of it I'd been taught. In school, when you learn about Vietnam, you learn very little about the Korean War. And I think the Korean War is actually more pivotal to our geopolitical reality than Vietnam is. I mean, we have a new Ken Burns documentary out about Vietnam. It's said to be kind of very both sidesy and doesn't really explain who the aggressor was. It's just part of this deluge of material catering to baby boomers. But the Korean War isn't really taught, and we definitely don't learn about the scorched earth campaign that MacArthur waged at the end of it. What's really important to understand about the Korean War is that it provided the basis for the archipelago of U.S. military bases around the world. I mean, the U.S. has a permanent or seemingly permanent presence in South Korean society. It's an obstruction to peace and reunification. It's imposed a culture of militarization on South Korea, but it was also the model for what John McCain wanted in Iraq and what the U.S. is now trying to do in Syria, where it's just starting to set up a series of bases in the east. But what McCain wanted in Iraq was U.S. military bases all the way to 2080. Obama might be the first president to obstruct the expansion of this archipelago of bases by pulling U.S. troops out of Iraq. And the U.S. has normalized relations with Vietnam, but with the situation on the Korean Peninsula, as Leon Panetta, the defense secretary under Obama, said in 2011, we are within an inch of war every day. And just a quick note, I did go to Seoul on my own dime. This is just part of the journalistic work I do and how I've always operated as a journalist. But if you want to support this work, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/moderate rebels, and you can support us in future podcasts. And we do want to do as much field reporting as possible. So, every penny you give us supports that.
And after this episode, we'll have another episode including an extended interview with a South Korean peace activist, and that is going to be published on our Patreon account for subscribers. So if you subscribe to our Patreon, you can actually have access to bonus content you won't hear elsewhere.
Now, people in the South that I met, they don't want war, even people on the right, although I did meet some right-wingers who say they're willing to withstand a war that would wipe out part of the South's population if they could completely destroy the North. I mean, these include some pretty well-placed people, but generally people don't expect a war to happen. They're not excited about the idea of losing millions more people. And certainly the North has this legacy of war that I'll discuss in a second. I mean, we really need to understand the full scope of the semi-genocidal U.S. and Allied campaign that they experienced. And you don't hear about this even within South Korea. I went to the main war museum in Seoul, and the scorched earth campaign that the U.S. waged is just wiped clean from the history presented there. The war is also presented, as it is in the U.S. official narrative, as a victory for the U.S. and the UN allies. It absolutely was not a victory. It wasn't a victory for anyone. Actually, I might tweet this out, but there was a shocking exhibition once you go through the whole history of the war on the first floor of the War Museum, where you just enter this room, and on the left side, there's a fairly advanced display of the word peace displayed in all the different languages, maybe in 50 different languages. And then on the right side, against the wall, there's a projection, freedom. So peace and freedom have been achieved through this war. And then in the center are a series of TV screens that descend from the ceiling like a pillar, in a circular kind of pillar. And on each screen are different pieces of U.S. military hardware being tested.
It's dystopian. It's like Brave New World.
And when you go up to the DMZ, you can actually, the demilitarized zone between the South and the North, you can actually see Chinook helicopters flying overhead, and you're hearing the drills that U.S. and South Korean forces are carrying out together. So that the real history of the war has been whitewashed in South Korea and in the U.S., and therefore I think it's impossible to understand the costs, not only the the physical cost, but the moral injury of empire. And therefore, I think most Americans who are now increasingly in favor of military action or willing to support some kind of military action against North Korea, they don't understand. They have no context for understanding this crisis except that Kim Jong-un is insane.
This insanity canard, of course, is a very convenient distraction from what North Koreans themselves have said. And believe it or not, they have government officials who release statements. And sometimes these statements are actually quoted in U.S. news outlets. Sometimes they're out of context, sometimes they're mistranslated. But even when you read them, they actually sound somewhat reasonable. So for instance, in the New York Times, a North Korean spokesperson was recently quoted saying, quote, "Nothing will be more foolish if the United States thinks it can deal with us the way it treated Iraq and Libya, miserable victims of its aggression, and Syria, which did not respond immediately, even after it was attacked." So again, we see that people in the DPRK, the official name of North Korea, are actually citing previous historical examples of countries where the U.S. pursued disastrous regime change policies that effectively destroyed the nation. So you have Iraq and Libya, which are virtually failed states, and Syria, where millions of people have been displaced, hundreds of thousands have been killed. I mean, this is the context that North Korea is operating within. And even U.S. officials have acknowledged this internally. So for instance, Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence, by no means any kind of anti-war stalwart, he acknowledged at the Aspen Security Forum this year, he said,
"The lessons that we learned out of Libya giving up its nukes and Ukraine giving up its nukes is, unfortunately, if you have nukes, never give them up. If you don't have them, get them."
Coates, the director of national intelligence, also added that for Kim, the leader of North Korea,
and he's not crazy. There is some rationale backing his actions, which are survival. Survival for his regime, survival for his country. And he has watched, I think, what has happened around the world relative to nations that possess nuclear capabilities and the leverage they have, and seen that having the nuclear card in your pocket results in a lot of deterrence capability.
And yeah, I mean, it's really that deterrence capacity that has prevented not only regime change, but it's kind of discredited the whole U.S. policy of rollback against North Korea, but in Asia as well. And that was actually one of the accomplishments of the DPRK in the Korean War. When I was in Seoul, a group of lawmakers from the right-wing Liberty Party, which is the main opposition party in the Korean parliament, went to Washington to lobby for tactical nuclear weapons. That would be it would be a deployment of nuclear weapons on the Korean mainland in contravention of all nuclear agreements. And it's opposed by the Moon administration. It will not happen at this point, but it's something that the U.S. and Trump appears to want, and it would represent a major escalation. At the same time, when you speak to even people within the Liberty Party, they have no vision of how those tactical nukes would be used, and it's because of the deterrent capacity of North Korea.
And also, again, what's lacking from the context of all of this is, of course, the very fundamental fact that the U.S. is the only country in the world that has ever dropped a nuclear bomb on a civilian population, and of course, not just once, but twice in Japan. And, just for history's sake, it's also important to recognize that the U.S. War Department Strategic Bombing Survey acknowledged, quote, "Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped." So it's important to keep that history in mind, but also the important context of what North Korea has continued to say today. In its 2016 Party Congress, actually, the DPRK pledged a no first-use policy, meaning Kim Jong-un said North Korea would, quote, "not use nuclear weapons first unless aggressive hostile forces use nuclear weapons to invade our sovereignty." The U.S. has not agreed to a no first use policy. In fact, dozens of times, the U.S. has threatened the DPRK and other countries with a nuclear strike. And even beyond that, John Swartz at The Intercept published an interesting article titled, "North Korea keeps saying it might give up its nuclear weapons, but most news outlets won't tell you that." And in this article, The Intercept actually cites Robert Carlin. Carlin is a scholar at Stanford. He also previously worked in the State Department's intelligence arm on Northeast Asia. Carlin has visited North Korea more than 30 times, and he pointed out that North Korea has repeatedly said that it would consider demilitarizing and getting rid of its nuclear weapons if the threats of the U.S. and its South Korean proxies were terminated. I mean, there's this kind of bombastic rhetoric, of course, but he always, on July 4th, Kim himself, the leader of North Korea, said, quote, unless the U.S. hostile policy and nuclear threat to the DPRK are definitely terminated. So again, like we see in Israel, Palestine, and many other places, we have the aggressor that's portrayed as the victim, and we have the country that is being targeted for regime change being portrayed as the aggressor, even though the DPRK, as Libya said before it, and other countries have said, is willing to demilitarize and get rid of its nuclear weapons if there is safety guaranteed. And of course, the U.S. is not willing to guarantee that safety.
That kind of explains why they're doing these missile tests. And there's another explanation, which is, the history of the Korean War. This is a country, North Korea, that has faced nuclear annihilation persistently since 1950. Now, it was in 1950 that Matthew Ridgway, who was the U.S. commander directly under General Douglas MacArthur, urging MacArthur, was a hot message to consider the use of atom bombs. And MacArthur himself kind of proposed using the atom bomb as a blocking blow for tactical purposes to seal off Korea at the Yalu River from Chinese and Soviet forces, which would have been obviously a huge disaster. Truman threatened to use a nuclear weapon in a press conference, and MacArthur and Ridgway also proposed the use of chemical weapons. They had an active discussion about whether chemical weapons should be used massively against DPRK forces. The only reason they weren't deployed was because of post-World War II prohibitions on chemical weapons, not for any moral reason. You have to understand the full scope of atrocities that North Korea endured. I mean, we're talking about the total destruction of their country and, mass slaughter. For example, the London Daily Worker documented with interviews with 20 eyewitnesses the slaughter of 7,000 North Korean prisoners who were either decapitated by sword or shot and dumped in mass graves. The article was headlined in the Daily Worker, U.S. Belsen in Korea, referring to Nazi extermination camps during the war. As I said, the war was not a victory. Douglas MacArthur was a failed general. After the landing at Incheon, which North Korea did not challenge, the U.S., under the banner of the UN, pressed into the north and were chased out with its tail between its legs as they were kind of overwhelmed by North Korean forces, supplemented by China. North Korea did a lot more of the fighting than we want to give them credit for. And in many senses, they were just simply terrified and in many cases, U.S. troops didn't even face directly North Korean forces. They just fled south. And this was such a huge humiliation that by 1952, the U.S. was carrying out a scorched earth campaign to literally destroy Pyongyang in every single city in North Korea. If you turn to one of the few, I think, honest histories on this war, to Professor Bruce Cummings or I.F. Stone's The Hidden History of the Korean War, you'll understand the full scope of destruction. In the 2 days between December 14th and 15th, Pyongyang was hit with 700 500-pound bombs. It was torched with napalm, and 175 tons of delayed fuse bombs were dropped on the city. And what were delayed fuse bombs? They detonated most of their explosive charge after rescuers arrived. They were designed as the original kind of double tap strike, which is what you hear about with U.S. drones in Pakistani tribal regions, for example. The U.S. tested 12,000-pound bombs in the place of atom bombs. For example, on the city of Gangye, which it wiped off the map. 550 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on the city of Siniju from B-29s. That city was wiped off the map. The U.S. eventually began in 1953 bombing North Korean dams. They flooded the rice farms of North Korea and wiped out the rice crop to starve the population. This was barely reported in U.S. media. Entire villages were inundated and wiped out with flooding. Pyongyang was even flooded.
It's also incredibly fascinating to look at the media reports from the time. There's no question that today the U.S. media is very biased, especially on issues like North Korea. But then there was not even a pretense of neutrality, and you had just really blatantly racist coverage in the media at the time. That's actually where the phrase "the Hermit Kingdom" comes from. You would see these overtly racist Orientalist caricatures of Koreans as this kind of backward people. And actually, some friends and journalistic colleagues of ours, Adam Johnson and Nima Shirazi, looked at some of these racist caricatures in a great episode they did of their podcast on North Korea. And their podcast is called Citations Needed. But we actually dug up an interesting New York Times report. This historian Bruce Cummings, in his book Korea's Place in the Sun, cites a New York Times article that was reported on a village that had been napalmed by the U.S. military. And the reporter George Barrett showed up to the town after it was attacked. And he wrote of these kinds of almost Holocaust-style conditions. And this is what he wrote, quote, "The inhabitants through the village and in the fields were caught and killed and kept the exact postures they held when the napalm struck. A man about to get on his bicycle, 50 boys and girls playing in an orphanage, a housewife strangely unmarked, holding in her hand a page torn from a Sears Roebuck catalog, crammed at mail order number 3,811,294 for a $2.98 bewitching bed jacket, coral."
So by July 1953, North Korea was fully destroyed. Its leadership was underground in tunnels that they had dug, and it's there that they stay, along with their weapons systems. There are advanced tunnel networks and bunker systems built into the mountains of North Korea, and that is the legacy of this war, along with the psyche of a nation that is indelibly scarred. Ben, you quoted Curtis LeMay, Strategic Air Command Director, who said that 20% of the population had been wiped out. LeMay commented in 1953 that he had been lobbying early on in 1950 the Truman administration to allow him to carry out this campaign of burning down entire villages, destroying cities, and they said, no, that's too much. And by the end, they acceded to his wishes, and ultimately he said, we burned down every town in North Korea and South Korea too. Why did they burn down much of South Korea? Well, there were many guerrilla fighters, basically the peasantry of South Korea, that sided with the North and wanted their own system, not a system that the U.S. had imposed on them. And the system that they actually turned to was not just kind of communism or Maoism. It was also a system that had been in place through people's collectives that existed prior to Japanese colonization, which is another scarring legacy we haven't even mentioned. So the war was not a victory for the U.S. The past isn't even past. Kim Il-sung defeated the policy of rollback, which was popular in Washington. It's now known as regime change. And Truman was forced into the policy of containment, which is now kind of the status quo. It's not clear if Washington wants to keep that status quo now. There are people in the South on the right wing who want to move towards the policy of rollback, which would be incredibly dangerous. And we do hear these threats not only from Trump, but also from Obama, who threatened the DPRK in 2016 by saying we could obviously destroy North Korea with our arsenals. So when I went to Korea, I wanted to talk to some of the people who were involved in trying to imagine a future without the U.S. dictating policy. And these are people who are very unpopular in South Korean society, although they're able to mobilize these massive protests. But what they told me about on Jeju Island, where the U.S. has basically established a quasi-secret naval base, and there's, the villagers are abused by the U.S. presence, or at Camp Humphrey, where farmers were driven off their land in order to establish a U.S. military base that Koreans had to pay for, a $10 billion military base, or at Soju, where the THAAD system is being placed. This is an advanced missile defense system, which probably won't even work against North Korean missiles, and it has extremely negative effects for the environment, including on humans, because of its powerful radars. And so you have like grandmas in Soju fighting police, highly militarized police with their canes because they don't want this in their backyard. So I think South Koreans increasingly are being forced to reckon with the negative effects of U.S.-imposed militarization, but the problem is that they don't see a way out. And ever since North Korea has started this rapid succession of defiant missile tests, public opinion in South Korea has really swung. So in June of this year, only 50% of the population supported deployment of the THAAD. Now that number's up to 80%. There's a lot of fear-mongering in South Korean media, and of course there's a lot of fear-mongering in our media, as I wrote about when I kind of did a content analysis of Jake Tapper, the consummate Beltway centrist coverage of Korea, where CNN they're actually running cartoons of North Korean missiles hitting the U.S. mainland, hitting California, and Barbara Starr, the CNN stenographer at the Defense Department, is claiming that North Korean missile tests have come within hundreds of miles of Western civilian airliners, and they could at some point hit a civilian aircraft. But there's no evidence that they could. We're just going to kind of entertain this possible threat scenario for the next 10 minutes. So U.S. public opinion is flipped as well.
And another thing about the media reports on North Korea is frequently, even when officials are actually quoted, their kind of bombastic rhetoric is taken at face value. And there's no question that sometimes the DPRK leadership does use this kind of fiery language, just like Trump and like others. And this is, of course, not unique. I mean, Gaddafi famously in Libya was notorious for using, very similar kind of bombastic language. But rhetoric is not the same thing as actions, of course. And just because North Korea is using this kind of fiery language to defend itself against, the threats of not just regime change, but nuclear war, doesn't mean that North Korea is actually planning on engaging in some of these things.
Actually, on my last day in Seoul, the North tested what is considered an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, but what might actually be an intermediate range missile with enhanced fuel capacity. It flew over Japan, actually at a height that would have made it sort of unreachable by any anti-missile system like the THAAD. And life continued in South Korea. People were not behaving with much alarm. The hype that you hear in the U.S. media isn't conveyed in South Korean society. They're very used to it. But they're also governed by a somewhat repressive military system, which even concerns their speech. And this was something that I spoke about in my interview with Wol-san Liem, who is from the Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union, who said that, many activists are now actually having their houses raided under the 1988 national security law, which is used in many cases to persecute anti-war activists and whistleblowers and leftists in general. And so South Korean democracy, to the extent that it exists, is really inhibited by the U.S. military presence and the ongoing conflict. A lot of people don't realize that South Korea came out of the war as a dictatorship that was essentially run by right-wing elements in the military, from Ri to Park. And there are still elements of that dictatorship that have not yet been removed, which makes being an anti-war activist or anti-empire activist extremely difficult, extremely challenging. My interaction with anti-war activists in South Korea reminded me of those that I had with anti-Zionist Jews inside Israel. One of the themes that keeps coming up, that came up in all of my interviews with anti-war activists, is how, and it's another parallel to Israeli society, is the military indoctrination that starts at youth of Korean children. In South Korea, it's Korean males, because they have full conscription only for males, and how this affects social relations between men and women. There's so many layers of militarization. And so I think this is just one of the more fascinating discussions I've had, and I was able to record it, and so I think you'll enjoy listening to it. This is Wol-san Liem. Okay, I'm Max Blumenthal. I'm in Seoul, Korea right now with Wol-san Liem, who is the Director of International and Korean Peninsula Affairs for the Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union, KPTU, which is another group that has been involved in the anti-THAAD protests. And Wol-san is a peace activist. And we're going to talk just a few hours after another DPRK missile launch. Missile flew over Japan, so I guess we're on the brink of another war of words between Trump and Abe and Kim. So I guess first I wanted to ask you, Wol-san, to just talk about some of the work you're doing here in South Korea and what role you and the unions you work with have played in the anti-THAAD protests and the significance of those protests.
Thank you. As you mentioned, I work for the Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union, which is one of the industrial affiliates of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which would be comparable to the U.S. AFL-CIO, so it's the national center. And within the labor movement, it's in our constitution and in our platform, as well as the KCTU's, to commit to a world without nuclear weapons and also the peaceful reunification of the Korean peninsula. And so all of the large industrial unions have committees that work on these issues, and for us, as you mentioned, our union has particularly been focusing on protesting the United States and South Korean governments and military's move to deploy THAAD missile defense systems in the Seongju region, in a small village in the Seongju County, which is about 3 hours outside of Seoul. And this is it's a weapon system that is part of the U.S. pivot to Asia, and so it's a weapon system that would be deployed in South Korea, but is part of the United States, would be included in the United States missile defense system, which is really, the word defense is in the title, but in fact it's about increasing the capacity of the U.S. military in the region to defend and then attack. And so we don't see it as defensive, we see it as increasing tensions in the region. And we've been working with the residents in that area to block the deployment. Unfortunately, the current government has been very aggressive about pushing forward with that deployment. And so we saw the deployment of 4 more launchers last week in the Soseongni area.
And if you're listening right now, there might be some ambient sound. We're sitting in a cafe. We were just talking, and I thought our conversation was so good we should record it. Wol-san, the residents of Seongju have specific complaints. In the U.S. we'd call them NIMBYs, like not in my backyard people, because it's just in the U.S. we don't have foreign militaries putting advanced missile systems in our neighborhoods that cause massive radar contamination. I think that's one of their complaints. And another complaint, I think, just from a purely practical standpoint, is that the THAAD device may not even work because the distance between the North Korean launchers to Seoul is so short. Talk about some of the problems with that, both locally and just practically.
The residents in the Seongju area, I'm saying Seongju and Soseongni. Soseongni is a small village in the Seongju County, which is right next to the Lotte Golf Course, which is where the THAAD is being deployed. And originally the residents in this area, and then the neighboring Kimcheon City, which is is directly above where the THAAD is being deployed. Their main concern, as you mentioned, was the radar and the impact of the radar waves that would have on the potential health impacts. And it's a farming area. It's an area that's famous for the farming of Korean melons, which is not something that you have in the United States, but it's a small yellow melon. And there was concern that the radar would have an impact on, for example, the bee population, and there would be some problems with pollination. We don't know what the impact would be because there hasn't been a full environmental impact assessment yet. And so the residents started out being very concerned about these local issues, as you mentioned, but then as they studied about what THAAD was, they realized very much, that it's ineffective in shooting down North Korean missiles for various reasons. As you mentioned, this is it's a missile defense that works high altitude, terminal missile defense, and so it's supposed to shoot down missiles that come in at a high altitude in the terminal phase. But because North Korea is close to South Korea, missiles shot to from North Korea to South Korea, if they indeed were shot, would not be high altitude. They would be at a much lower altitude, and so already THAAD is not effective against that because of that distance issue. At the same time, THAAD has been the only tests that have been really effective in proving THAAD's ability to shoot down any kind of missile have been done in incredibly controlled simulated situations. And so there are a lot of military experts in the United States as well that will tell you that THAAD missile defense doesn't work, period. And yet it's like $1 trillion or something to create one of these launching units, one of the units. And so it's a massive waste of money, taxpayers' money. We don't even know if it really works. And beyond that, I think the residents in the Seongju area realize that this, because it is part of the United States increasing its military capacity in the region, the deployment of THAAD, not just in Seongju, but anywhere on the Korean Peninsula, is creating greater tensions with North Korea. So it's part of contributing to this aggressive response from North Korea. It's also creating serious problems with China, so much so that there's an economic impact. And so the residents in the Seongju area, they started out by saying, we don't want THAAD in Seongju, and they ended up saying, we don't want THAAD anywhere on the Korean Peninsula. And they have been fighting, it doesn't matter where it's going to be stationed, we don't want it anywhere. And that's why it's not just a local struggle, but it's something that peace activists around the country have been involved in. And also it has regional and global implications.
When I talk to right-wingers here, Liberty Party supporters, they say, that North Korea has this strategy of, the hat strategy, and that the hat is the U.S. on South Korea, and that North Korea aims to loosen the strings on the hat by provocative things like missile launches, and that we have to demonstrate unity. And their mantra is unity, together with the U.S., one hand. But in order to demonstrate unity around the THAAD system, South Korea has had to bear, as you said, economic impact. China has sanctioned South Korea, and it's been hit with a serious economic toll. So to what extent is this relationship with the U.S. actually harming average people in the Republic of Korea?
You're right. I think and it's not just conservatives who feel that we have to show some strength and the strength of the U.S.-Korea military alliance. Unfortunately, in a different way and to maybe a lesser extent, but very much so, the current so-called liberal or left government of Moon Jae-in also has come out, in part because of pressure from the right, but also because of seeing it as important, has come out very strongly about the importance of stressing the strength of the U.S. military alliance, which is why, unfortunately, even though the current president had promised not to deploy THAAD in a rushed manner without an environmental impact assessment and without ratification in the parliament, he went ahead and did it, even though he knows as well that it's not really effective against North Korean missiles. So unfortunately that's going on, and you're right, the impact on the Korean people in the immediate, the economic impact, because Korea does a lot of trade with China. It's the most important trading partner. There's been huge impact in terms of suddenly no tourists from China in the tourist centers in South Korea, and so they're suffering really severely. Just today, the Lotte, which owns the land where the THAAD is being deployed and had over 100 duty-free shops opened in China, just announced it's pulling its duty-free, it's selling all of its duty-free shops in China, right? And so there's an impact there, as well as for actors and singers who had tours scheduled in China that were getting canceled. And it's not just Lotte, as well as car makers and the like. So the economic impact is huge, and that clearly it creates more instability in the economy as a whole. If you go to the U.S. military alliance in the long run, I mean, not just this immediate issue of THAAD, but this long-term military alliance that the United States has had, South Korea has had with the United States since the Cold War, or really the end of World War II. It would be good to have a figure, but since that time, South Korea has stationed U.S. forces, for which it pays a big despite what Trump says, it pays a very big portion of the cost of stationing the troops. South Korea is forced to buy Lockheed Martin and Boeing weapons and bring them into South Korea. And so that's a huge figure as well. And so there's a whole bunch of money, right, that is going into upholding this alliance that could be used for increasing welfare, increasing public services, that isn't happening. And that's obviously an impact. On top of that, this militarized relationship it's about defending against North Korea, in fact, increases tensions with North Korea, so that South Korea has been living in a state of war for the last 70 years, and the people of South Korea have to live a daily life under the threat of war or the threat of some kind of conflict breaking out. And so you can say that the impact is really uncalculable.
I think another impact that can't be calculated or quantified is the one on the South Korean psyche and on the North Korean psyche. But talk about the effect of the legacy of the Korean War, which has never officially ended, on the psyche of South Koreans. And how does that shape people politically? Talk about how they're educated and how full military conscription affects especially the male population.
Yeah, the South Korea has lived under, through the Cold War in this close alliance with the United States. As you mentioned, the Korean War, which truce was signed. The fighting of the Korean War ended in 1950. It was 1950 to 1953, so ended in 1953, but a peace treaty was never signed, and so the armed fighting is technically stopped, but North Korea and the United States and China are still technically at war. South Korea was not a signature to the armistice, but obviously is still part of that war. And so South Koreans and North Koreans have grown up for generations now, essentially in a state of war, in the sense that war could break out again at any time, and that is used in South Korea by the right to justify a very anti-communist mentality. So there's a national security law that's used to prosecute a whole bunch of things that left people do, as well as this idea of threats to the national security. A lot of times, if you are calling for peace or something, you get labeled a communist, and people who have been accused and persecuted or prosecuted under the national security law go to jail very easily. As you mentioned, there's a conscription for all men except for if you have disability or something, go to the army for 2 years. So that's a huge chunk of your young life where you're separated from the rest of the population. And my own experience with this, not only does, a lot of that military culture comes into workplaces. Workplaces are very hierarchically organized and follow a kind of military culture. It also, I think, contributes to male-female tensions because of a difference of experience. So women don't go to the army. So men experience this very militarized culture that women don't experience, and in some ways, they don't lose those 2 years of their lives, and so there's a gap there, right? And because of this division of North and South Korea, and the constant state of threat of war, that was used as a justification for military dictatorship in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, until a democratization movement overthrew military dictatorship, or got the military dictatorship to allow for free elections. And so that means that there has been, the military dictatorship was led to a real violation of basic civic rights and freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, which still, lives on today. And so that's something that the left has been fighting for a long time. And I think it also contributes to the polarization of society, because on the one hand, there's a sector of society that is very anti-communist and justifies military, feels like these kinds of repressions are important or needed. And then there's a left that is fighting against for basic human rights and basic freedom of expression and freedom of association. And so there has been severe conflict, which you may know led to candlelight protests and overthrowing or led to the impeachment of the previous very conservative government.
I wonder, how does the national security law govern our conversation right now? And how has it been applied historically, and how is it in a contemporary sense being applied?
It's not really governing our conversation, but the national security law has been used against activists. Often it's been used against activists who are, having some relationship, have some, maybe travel to North Korea or have some contact with people in North Korea, or there is suspect that the organizations that they're part of have a relationship with North Korea or have pro-North leanings. Now, often that's really exaggerated, but people that I work with have had their houses raided, and people that I know have gone to jail. As you may or may not know, there was a one progressive party that the government accused of being pro-North and seeking to build a revolutionary organization that was going to create an internal uprising in South Korea, and that party was disbanded by the Constitutional Court. So it was found to be unconstitutional, disbanded a few years ago. So that's a pretty stark example of how this overall anti-communist ideology and the national security law are influencing people's daily lives. And sometimes it's not just organizations that have relationships with North Korea or travel to North Korea, but sometimes it's an excuse to use to crack down on more broad sections of the left, like labor unions and the like.
I mean, has it really suppressed left activism in a serious way? And to what extent can you say South Korea is a democracy as long as laws like this are in place?
I think that democracy is not complete in South Korea, and there is a strong drive to win a complete democracy. And on the one hand, clearly the national security law, I think, creates, not because of, like, as an individual, I'm worried I'm going to be prosecuted under the national security law, therefore I'm not going to say something that I'm thinking or something like that, but more because of the broader environment, the broader social environment that's created, which is to have a general feeling that joining a labor union is not a good thing, or general feeling that talking about peace is how can you talk about having dialogue with North Korea when they're shooting off missiles, or how can you talk about traveling to North Korea when that's a threat to national security. That general public sentiment maybe makes it hard for broad-scale movements. I mean, very convicted activists, maybe it motivates them more, but to build a broad-based movement, the general social environment, I think, it's a difficult one to work in. It's a difficult one to organize unions in. It's a difficult one to organize broad-based peace movement in. So I don't know if that answers the question. There have been moments of opening and moments of opening of social space and ability to exercise, to act, to exercise dissent or to exercise rights, more so at certain times and less so at other times. The last 10 years have been really, really bad. And since the new administration, it's a little better. So, for example, you see media workers strike right now, and what they're striking against is they're like, now we have a little bit of space opened up. They're striking against all the censorship that they've been facing. So it's like the reporters and PDs and staff of two of the main broadcasting stations, public broadcasting stations, and they are calling for the resignations of the company CEOs because of the censorship and so that shows you a certain opening of social space that's going on right now.
Are you in the work you're doing unpopular in South Korea, and what kind of attacks do you receive from nationalistic elements?
The union movement gets all sorts of attacks, and it's similar in some ways to the U.S. So this idea that there's a labor aristocracy and the union movement doesn't represent workers, but at the same time, it has two class-based politics that are actually communist. I mean, there's that kind of discourse that's out there a lot. Myself personally, maybe I'm not, such a important person that I'm getting attacked personally. Although, in 2015, the labor movement and other progressive forces had a massive protest. For us, the main issue was a regressive labor law reform. Following that, there was a huge crackdown on unionists, and just about everybody's records were tracked by the Korean CIA or the police. So you can ask your phone company to see if the police have asked for your records, and so we all were, everybody had records of the CIA or the police asking for data from our phone companies at the very least, and many people were charged and investigated and went to jail. I think our union had about 500 charges and several people who were in jail, including one of our vice presidents for a year and a half, or a little over a year. It was so in the relationship to this one major protest, there were charges of obstructing traffic and violating the law and the law in protests, and then fighting with the police or the like, right? And so, in fact, the president of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, our national center, is still in jail right now, and our vice president came out at the end of last year.
So they call you union thugs here? That's that's the language in the U.S. You're nodding. I guess just personally, how did you become a union organizer? How did you embark on this path to being a peace activist and union organizer when there's so much pressure to go in another direction?
I'm actually Korean American, so I was born and raised in the U.S. and I was active in the Korean American community before coming to South Korea. And I, as many Korean American activists are, I was involved in both immigrant rights work, but then also work around U.S. policy towards North Korea and the South Korea military alliance from the U.S. side, the Korean American side. And then when I came to South Korea, I think it was at a moment of economic crisis globally, and the contradictions of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, were becoming apparent in new ways in the form of neoliberalism, and increasing inequality globally. And it seemed to me at that time that the most important work was to build a class-based movement. And although there's a lot of internal criticism, self-criticism, I would say on a global level, the Korean labor movement still maintains a pretty strong class identity, maybe more so than in Western countries. And so labor unions, it's a contradictory form of organizing because it's both within the capitalist system, but it's a class-based sense of organizing. And so I felt like being in a union was sort of an important place to be, to build a class-based movement. But then the unions in Korea are the KC2 unions have been called social movement unions as well. And so and because of living in a divided country, the unions have always been involved in work for unification and anti-war and peace work. And so within my union, I'm in charge of both international solidarity and the peace and unification work.
And what do anti-war and peace activists want? Is it a temporary freeze on U.S. South Korean military drills? I guess that would also be drilling with Japan and North Korean launches, or is it a comprehensive peace agreement, or is reunification something you can practically talk about?
I think you just talked about everything, and it's sort of short-term, mid-term, and long-term. So in the short term, there's a real tensions are growing. It's a very dangerous time right now. I personally don't think North Korean missile tests are helpful to the situation. I think they're increasing tension. They're making talks more difficult. What really needs to happen is that all military aggression is frozen and dialogue towards de-escalation of tensions starts quickly. Of course, the United States has the most power in the situation, therefore it has the most responsibility. And so the United States and South Korea need to come together around creating the conditions where it's easier for North Korea to come to the bargaining table. And that would be by stopping the war of words, stopping joint military exercises. And you mentioned Japan. I mean, this drive towards a U.S., Korea, Japan military alliance, at least stopping the immediate military actions to sit down and talk, and then North Korea should come to the table. After that, as you just said, the more long-term goal is to get an end to the Korean War through the signing of a peace treaty, and that peace treaty would have to include in it assurances to the North Korean state that its security wasn't threatened, and so that would mean some agreement about the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. It would mean something about a permanent stop to the joint exercises. It would be a withdrawal of the policy of potential of preemptive nuclear strike on North Korea by the United States. And then beyond that, that would be the first step towards having real peace on the Korean peninsula, including working out the division, getting beyond the division. Whether that would be in the form of a reunited country, I mean, that may be very difficult because the two countries now have lived with different systems for 70 years. And so maybe unification could be a very concrete, it can have a very concrete meaning of really joining, creating one country, or it could have a different, more symbolic meaning, but about learning how to live in peace with each other. And I think that is a potential solution as well. But we're not at that stage yet. That's a long-term goal. I
guess my last question would be, as someone who represents the Korean diaspora and who does solidarity work, what can Americans do to support the people in Seongju who are protesting imposition of the American militarization of their community? What kind of message should Americans send to their government?
I think a lot of people in the United States don't know what that is. I don't think they know very much about what's going on in Seongju and that fight going on. So the first thing would be to just get the word out as much as possible. The second thing is we actually had a delegation of American peace activists here last month, and they were 2 months ago at the end of July. It was Medea Benjamin from Code Pink, Jill Stein from the Green Party, Rhys Chenault from U.S. Labor Against the War, and Will Griffin from Veterans for Peace. And so it was a good delegation, and they started a petition calling for a freeze for a freeze. So a freeze of U.S. and South Korean hostilities for a freeze of North Korean hostilities. And so those kind of petition actions, like on a mass scale, submitted in some way to the South Korean that one was to South Korean government and the United States, to Trump administration, but pressure on the Trump administration in that way. I think any type of action that you can do like that is important, and definitely let us know in Korea so that people here know. And I also think that the United States the left has a lot of work to do to come together with a strong, united platform against the current administration on a lot of issues, militarism being one of them, but also clearly environment and immigration reform and healthcare. And those forces need to come together nationally, right? So that we have a framework that's powerful for putting these demands forward. And that would be really, really inspiring, I think, for people here in Korea.
Well, thank you so much, Wol-san, for those really insightful remarks. This was Moderate Rebels in Seoul, Korea, and that's all.
Thanks for listening. As Max said, he paid for his trip to Seoul to do reporting out of his own pocket. So if you would like to support what we're doing here at Moderate Rebels, and if you'd like to gain access to exclusive content, please consider subscribing at our Patreon page. That is patreon.com/moderaterebels. And of course, we're on social media. We're on Twitter at Moderate Radio, and we're on Facebook at Moderate Rebels Radio. Thanks for listening.